The Voice referendum was resoundingly defeated on the 14th of October. In the wake of the defeat, prominent Yes advocates and advocacy bodies went into a week of silence. Now that silence is broken, and their assessment of the result is unsurprisingly scathing, labelling it as a shameful act amongst other things. The comments were so bad that even prominent Yes campaigner Greg Craven described it as a dead-end car wreck of a response. So let's analyse the response in detail and let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. Now, the primary response is in an unsigned open letter, purportedly from Yes leaders. It's been widely reported in the media, and the full text is available from the Monthly amongst other outlets, and I'll link to that in the description below. The Central Land Council has also released a separate statement. It, however, was rather more measured. Several other statements also exist, for example statements from people like Thomas Mayo, who blamed disinformation amongst other things. Ironically, of course, Thomas Mayo's own statements were probably doing more to help the No campaign than anything else, but I'll leave that to one side. We can detect several themes in this open letter. First, there is general anger. The open letter states, "The truth is that the majority of Australians have committed a shameful act, whether knowingly or not, and there is nothing positive to be interpreted from it." They also say, "We feel acutely the repudiation of our peoples and the rejection of our efforts to pursue reconciliation in good faith. That people who came to our country only in the last 235 years would reject the recognition of this continent's First Peoples on our sacred land, which you have cared for and nurtured for more than 65,000 years, is so appalling and mean-spirited as to be utterly unbelievable a week following. It will remain unbelievable and appalling for decades to come." So let's disentangle that just briefly, and here I'm going to focus on the recognition part. They've asserted that the Voice referendum was about recognition, when indeed it was actually about that, but also much more. It wasn't just recognition, it was the voice. People were voting on both parts. It is simply misleading to assert that this referendum was only about recognition when it was about a voice body which could potentially have contained power and led to other things such as treaty, something I'll come back to in a second. Second, the open letter sounded a distinct separatist tone. They state, "We accept that the majority of non-Indigenous voting Australians have rejected recognition in the Australian Constitution. We do not for one moment accept that this country is not ours, always was, always will be. It is the legitimacy of the non-Indigenous occupation in this country that requires recognition, not the other way around. Our sovereignty has never been ceded." They also state, "In refusing our people's right to be heard on matters that affect us, Australia chose to make itself a less liberal and less democratic country. Our right to be heard continues to exist both as a democratic imperative for this nation and as our inherent right to self-determination. The country can deny the former, but not the latter. A founding document without recognition of the First Peoples of this country continues to be a process of colonisation. It is clear no reform of the Constitution that includes our peoples will ever succeed." So there are several things to disentangle. First, I've already talked about the recognition idea. The referendum was not just about recognition, it was about the voice. So pinning the referendum as being about recognition is simply false. Second, we've got the assertion that Indigenous Australians don't have a right to be heard over matters that affect them. Well, indeed, they have the same right to be heard as every other Australian, which comes in the form of a vote. Every other Australian has that exact same right. So if Indigenous Australians lack the right to be heard over matters that affect them, then so does everyone else. And then we've got the idea of self-determination, and the idea that Australia's constitution is somehow not valid. I suspect that's kind of a dead-end argument, but in any case, I guess they can make that if they really want to. But I will note that the sovereign citizens movement has manifestly failed in that argument as well. The sovereign citizens movement basically asserts that each individual is their own sovereign citizen that can be bound by their own laws. Typically, this comes to a head when a person is accused of failing to pay their taxes, and the ATO then pursues them. Routinely, courts have found against the sovereign citizens movement. One could then argue that the courts are very likely to find against the idea that Indigenous Australians have their own separate constitution from the dominant constitution that applies to everyone. Third, the open letter accuses the No campaign of lying and the mainstream media of being complicit. The open letter states, "The high levels of support for Yes in our communities exposes the No campaign's lies, taken up by the mainstream media even in the last week of the campaign." So focusing on that one for the moment, presumably they're saying that the No campaign lied about the level of support amongst Indigenous Australians. Well, to be clear, we don't actually know how much Indigenous Australians supported the Voice or not. Anthony Green of the ABC has suggested that the remote polling booths in predominantly Indigenous areas voted in favour of the referendum. However, not all Indigenous Australians live in those areas, and we don't know the exact voting patterns in other locations. At the referendum, you're not asked what your ethnicity or nationality is, rather you're just asked what your vote is. Therefore, we don't know for sure exactly how many Indigenous Australians voted yes or voted no. What we do know is two prominent No campaign leaders were Indigenous, so it's clearly false to assert that all Indigenous Australians supported the voice, because obviously not everyone did. The exact numbers we don't know, however. But to some extent, it's a little bit beside the point, because the support of all Australians is necessary here. Because if you're going to impose a voice body that itself could have power due to its ability to make representations, to litigate over those representations, and its right to be consulted on various things and to litigate over consultations, if you're going to have a voice body that is relatively powerful relative to other individuals, then those individuals have a right to have a say over whether that voice should exist. The open letter also states, lies in political advertising and communication were a primary feature of this campaign. This included resurrecting scare campaigns seen during the 1990s against land rights. But the scale of deliberate disinformation and misinformation was unprecedented, and it proliferated unchecked on social media, repeated in mainstream media, and unleashed a tsunami of racism against our people. We know that the mainstream media failed our people, favouring a false sense of balance over facts. Now, they haven't exactly pointed to what exact forms of disinformation or misinformation they are getting at here. They're just asserting it as such, and that's a rather cheap argument. It's very easy to say someone you disagree with is spreading misinformation or disinformation, but it is incumbent upon you to actually point out why they're incorrect. That is, what exact argument are they saying was misinformation or disinformation? The ones that seem to be repeated in this context are the arguments that the voice would have had power. Sometimes people assert that that is misinformation, but it is very clearly actually correct. It is very clear that the voice would have had power, like I've said, due to its representation rights and its consultation rights, and the fact it would have been the only constitutionally enshrined body to have such rights, thereby enabling it to control a narrative relative to other countervailing views. That very clearly gives rise to implicit power. Furthermore, as I've indicated in prior videos, the Yes campaign had its own fair share of misinformation and objectively false things that it spread. Now, in terms of the mainstream media favouring a, quote, false sense of balance, I'm not totally sure what mainstream media they were looking at, because if you look at the ABC or SBS, they very clearly were favouring the yes side of the campaign. It appears here that they were just advocating for deplatforming of the no campaign altogether, something that Megan Davis tweeted and then deleted about. So it seems that any airing of no campaign would give rise to a, quote, false sense of balance according to this open letter. The open letter also states, this shameful victory belongs to the Institute of Public Affairs, the Centre for Independent Studies, and the mainstream media. Again, asserting that the mainstream media was somehow complicit in this, which is really very odd. It appears they believe that only the yes side of the story needs to be heard in the mainstream media, and any countervailing views ought not to be aired, which is obviously not how a democracy ought to work. Fourth, the open letter suggests that vast swathes of the no campaign were racist or stupid or both. It states, but this campaign went beyond racism. Quote, if you don't know, vote no. Give expression to ignorance and licensed the abandonment of civic responsibility on the part of many voters who voted no. Now here they're asserting that part of the reason the no campaign succeeded was racism. And I will acknowledge that racists very likely voted no in this campaign. However, I also want to note that one of the core reasons people voted no was a belief that the voice would have given rise to division and would have given rise to discrimination, and that therefore would suggest they were actually voting against racism, i.e. many people felt that the voice was racist and they voted no for exactly that reason. Now, regardless of which side of the camp you fall on, that reason for voting no is not voting no for racism, it's voting no because you believe the voice is divisive and divides people by race. Now, we focus on the don't know, vote no slogan. That again has been completely misinterpreted by parts of the Yes campaign. What don't know, vote no means is that if the government has failed to perhaps assuage your concerns about the voice, if the government has failed to provide sufficient details, if the government has failed to perhaps clarify the powers of the voice in an adequate manner, and you don't know exactly how powerful it's going to be, if you don't know exactly what the voice is going to do, if it has uncertain outcomes and raises the risk of a bad outcome, and you don't know exactly for sure exactly the level of that risk or what the outcomes are going to be, then that is why one would vote no. Basically saying you believe the voice is going to be a risk and therefore you would vote no. That's what the slogan means. The slogan doesn't mean don't find out any information. The slogan means you've attempted to find out and you couldn't get the information you wanted. This was made even worse by the fact that portions of the Yes campaign were spreading outright contradictory pieces of information. For example, if we're looking at things like treaty, you'd get people like George Williams and Megan Davis saying that without the voice, a treaty is vulnerable. You have Noel Pearson suggesting that the voice would lead to treaty. But on the other hand, you have Anthony Albanese suggesting that it is completely irrelevant. The two aren't compatible. They are contradictory arguments. So when people try to find information, they got contradictory information, and therefore they were simply concerned about what the actual impact of the voice would be. I.e., they didn't know what the voice would do because the Yes campaign wasn't giving them adequate answers. So here, the responsibility and the blame really needs to lie on the Yes campaign for failing to properly articulate in a consistent manner what was going on. Fifth, they also blamed the coalition. They state, the support for the referendum collapsed from the moment the Liberal and National Party leaders, Mr Dutton and Mr Littleproud, chose to oppose the Voice to Parliament proposal after more than a decade of bipartisan support. This proposal was tracking 60% support compared to 40% opposition for several years, until the national and political parties preferred wanton political damage over support for some of this country's most disadvantaged people. There was little the Yes campaign could do to countervail this. And again, here, this is misleading. First, there was not bipartisan support for the Voice. There might have been bipartisan support for some form of recognition, but not bipartisan support for the Voice. Malcolm Turnbull, for example, before he decided to backflip, didn't like the Voice, as but one example. There was not bipartisan support for this. So painting it as if there was is simply false. I.e., there appears to be misinformation in this open letter itself. They seem to be rather loose with claiming that one side is spreading misinformation, when they themselves don't seem to be able to get their facts straight. Furthermore, if you're looking at the support here, it's saying that the Voice was tracking 60% support. That's a little bit misleading. It's tracking 60% support before the actual referendum amendment text came out and the campaign actually occurred in full. I.e., people liked the idea of the Voice until they found out information. It is completely inaccurate to say that there is support for it before they know what it is. There was support in principle, and then people saw the model and they didn't like what the model was. That is why we saw the decline in support over time. Furthermore, if you actually look at the seats that voted no, these were overwhelmingly Labour seats. The vast majority of Labour seats actually voted no in this referendum. Indeed, some of the former Liberal heartland seats, the ones that are now occupied by Teals, voted yes, which suggests that Peter Dutton's opposition to the Voice probably didn't actually shift the needle very much, telling me the Liberal Party hasn't actually gotten that much more support throughout the referendum campaign. Rather, it appears that people were voting no, regardless of what the Liberal Party actually thought. Sixth, and finally, they appear to be committed to the Uluru Statement in full, which is relatively unsurprising, and to establishing an independent voice entity, i.e. a voice entity that is neither in legislation nor in the Constitution. Now, exactly what shape that takes, well, that remains to be seen. Exactly how effective it is, again, remains to be seen. After all, if they go down the Thomas Mayo route, the rather aggressive and vitriolic route, it probably won't actually achieve very much. Now, if we're focusing on the Uluru Statement, well, Australians resigningly rejected this in the referendum. After all, they voted against the Voice, so it is obvious they would also vote against a treaty, which would be the next part of the Uluru Statement. So the Uluru Statement appears to be at an end at this moment. So the commitment to it, while unsurprisingly, doesn't appear like it would actually go anywhere. Although I will note that people like Anthony Albanese and some state leaders do still seem to be committed to a treaty process, despite what their electorate actually wants. So that overall is the response of the Yes leaders to the Voice referendum result. It's clearly rather angry, it's clearly rather vitriolic, and clearly has a rather dim view of no voters. However, I would be interested to hear your thoughts about this open letter in the comments below, and about whether this response is actually going to be effective.